Okay. So thank you, everyone, for coming back for our panel speaking with our speakers. I'm going to be moderating this panel. With Wendy's guidance, we placed these papers together because they serve to get at themes of interiority that portraiture helps us reassess and also deconstruct. And after reflecting on all of these wonderful papers, I thank all of you so much for your really insightful and thoughtful reflections and writing. It seems to me artists over time have sought to push the boundary of people's expectations of portraiture. And it's really interesting to compare the selfie of, say, 2018 to the composite poster portrait of 1925, because they both were grappling with some of the questions we grapple today as curators at the National Portrait Gallery. So Jonathan Walz describes the ways in which artists made deliberate challenges to mimetic modes of creating portraits, and his thoughtful analysis raises the question about the portrait. So who is it for? Is it for the artist? Is it for the sitter? And so what I'm hoping to do is sort of outline the questions for each of our speakers, and then you can go ahead and answer, and then we will open it up for the audience to also ask questions. So Jonathan, I'm wondering if you wouldn't mind musing on the question: does portraiture's purpose, as you have outlined, help us understand how we construct identity today? Like, how has that, from the period, maybe one or two of the pieces that you took a deep dive into in the early 20th century, if you can do a little compare and contrast, I think that would be of interest for us. Change in portraiture informed Richard Saunders' talk today also. As we just heard, he looked closely at the way in which technology, namely the internet, has shifted popular focus from this introspective portrait, sort of the opposite of what Akela was talking about, into an outward-facing identity. And everyone today, it seems, has created their selfie. You've perfected it. You know how to sort of turn the cheek or pop the hip or put the hand, in a certain. I mean, we all get it, right? So, I was thinking, it's interesting to think about Richard's talk and how the selfie portrait employs different technology and dissemination is actually not that different. And he makes this point: it's not that different than pre-selfie America. And Amy Mooney's talk on Woodard's studio in Chicago is one example of the reshaping of Black identity. It tells us how important self-fashioning can be and was in the early 20th century in particular. So, Richard, I know people who know me, they will tell you I'm a bit of a cynic at times. So with apologies to your optimistic essay, I do wonder how technology has begun to threaten our safe ways of self-actualization. So if you can muse a little bit about that, thinking about how facial recognition technology might undermine the ways in which portraiture has traditionally sought to construct identity. I mean, is your face really yours today? So things like that. And you can feel free to take it and run or not, turn it into something you want to talk about. Akela Reason's delightful reflection on how a biography informs portraiture and the multidisciplinary examination. I also sort of learned, okay, so it's not interdisciplinary, it's multidisciplinary, thanks to you. Or study that portraiture helps us consider the so-called soul of the sitter and what exactly that meant in the 19th century. Portrait photographers may have been following contemporary pulse of the moment, which Virginia Woolf called, as you tell us, the new biography, and looked to understand the truth of character in the sitter. In a way, this is an idea that emerged out of the Enlightenment. So the Age of Enlightenment really is an Anglo tradition that places the individuality and the individual at the center of culture. And the fact that the individual is allowed to self-actualize and even expected to really informs the sort of foundational thinking behind portrait galleries. And if you think about portrait galleries, there's only about 4 or 5 in the whole world, and they're all Anglo countries or former colonies of England that really subscribe to this idea. So I wonder if Akela might be willing to talk more about whether she thinks individualism and interiority still matters today, because with the selfie, is our face our own? Does our interiority even matters, to this day? Or if we might have become less distinctive amongst and between ourselves. I mean, so portraiture is sort of at stake here, in a way. And finally, Amy Mooney's fantastic scholarship brings out how even commercial portraiture serves the forging of activism and a positive reconstruction or flipping construction of Black identity. So if Woodard exemplifies a larger social moment, I'm very interested in the sort of time slippage that you were outlining, sort of the past into the future. And I love that we, in creating our identity, we can link our past with our future. So was Woodard really conscious of that? It seems like he was probably more purposeful as the lead architect behind some of this portraiture that he made hundreds and hundreds of photos, right, and portraits. And it seemed to me that you were saying that his patrons knew he was doing this and sought him out specifically for that. So were they conscious too of this sort of slippage between the past and the present and the future? And so those are my questions, just to get us started. So anyone want to start?
Well,
yes, you're on.
Can people hear me? Is that okay? Having started my career looking at the 18th century, where there's very little documentation for many of our arguments, and working closely with Ellen Miles, who is not here now but was here earlier. And we've talked at great length about what can we learn from these images, and what did the sitters actually say, and what did the painters actually say, and how much is just modern theory being applied to something we don't know a lot about. So we were starting at that point, and so you hang on those little tidbits of information, like someone in Philadelphia saying that they are never going to send their wife and children to go be painted by a certain painter because he paints so badly, and it's just not going to end well. And okay, so you know right from the start that there's an enormous amount of self-importance and prestige in getting the right result, right? Okay, so looking then through the 19th century and looking at photography and how we reacted to photography and its development, and then following that all the way up to the contemporary era and how we're trying to analyze selfies and what they really mean, I am a believer that I don't think that much has really changed. The volume of material is entirely different. But the aspirations of the people, whether they were wealthy Philadelphians or whether they're all of us today, sure, you can cite exceptions, but I don't think that as a rule, the attitudes of the people who are taking selfies and then thinking about what am I doing, who am I going to share this with, why am I taking this, which is a lot of it's subconscious as you're doing it, is the same kind of thing that you're commissioning an oil-on-canvas portrait. You want to make sure you have the latest fashion from London. You want to make sure that you are being presented as someone who is sophisticated, even though you may not be. Someone who's attractive, even though attractive by whatever standards of the time are being applied. That even though you may not look quite the way your portrait looks. And I was struck by Kim saying yesterday that in taking visitors around or taking people who have just had their portraits added to the permanent collections of the National Portrait Gallery, that they've said, well, that doesn't look like me. And that's a wonderful little question to try to answer. And because I think that most people probably think they look a certain way, and whatever image doesn't come up to whatever your idealized images of yourself is something that you're not going to accept. You're going to hit delete when you take that selfie, and you're saying, no, that's not me, or whatever it is. So I'm a great believer that we're trying to make sense of this volume of material that we have to work with, and it is a little terrifying. I'm glad I'm not working at the Archives of American Art. I was just talking with a colleague about that and saying that, how are we going to make sense of tweets and Instagram and self-portraits? So anyway, but I think it's going to take a little while to get through it, and I think we'll probably, sooner rather than later, have the tools to make more sense than we can make of it right now.
Okay. Thank you.
Should we just go in line?
That would be great.
Okay, sure. So thank you, Kate, for your questions regarding Woodard's practice. There were a couple threads that you seem to offer up to pick up. One, I'd like to think a little bit more about the kind of social purpose that Woodard saw his work performing. And especially, he was really conscientious about the way you were talking about idealization of the self. And he knew that patrons did not necessarily want to look overly idealized and overly drawn out. And he talked about refraining from manipulation of the negative to that end, to idealize the self. Because he talked about the social project of being in the parlor and passing the photographs around. And that then there would be this moment of comparison between the photograph and the patron, and that people felt really uncomfortable if they had a photograph that didn't look like themselves. So it was really interesting that you could get this idealized self, but then I'm going to be sitting here comparing it to how you really look and say, what's up with that? So it was interesting to think that he was trying to position his practice in that in-between, where he was offering a likeness that his patrons found to be acceptable, found to be representative of themselves, but also didn't go as easily as technology was allowing him to do to that manipulative point. And so it's a kind of balance, it seems, between the patron and the practice. And Woodard's practice, we have to remember too, wasn't just this one photographer. And I tried to make that really clear. He had innumerable employees, and that also then allows for the variety of styles that we see and approaches. So we have to be really mindful that this was actually a franchise, with more than 4 locations in Kansas City, Cleveland, New York, and Chicago, all simultaneously. They closed down around the 1940s. I'm still looking for some vestiges of this, but the archive has not given up every aspect of this amazing individual's life. And the other thing that you asked too about the question of slippage, yesterday we had a wonderful presentation on that idea of going backwards to, again, have a kind of history that previously had been denied, or a history that was completely oppressive. We see now individuals at the Woodard's moment, I do think conscientiously, making histories for themselves, the way that they saw themselves, the way they wanted to be seen, the way they saw individuals. If we look more broadly beyond Woodard's to some of the other Chicago studios, or even in the kind of archives that we're more familiar with Vandersea, you see portraits of others coming into the contemporary portrait, where you'll actually hold a beloved's image with you, so that again, you're linking past, present, and ultimately the action you're doing is, of course, making something for the future. So you're always kind of, I think, aware of and compelled to use the portrait to that end.
That's great. Thank you. Wow.
So that's a great setup for one of the thoughts I have, which is that in the dissertation, I really try to think through what I see as the avant-garde modernists who are in an oppositional role to mainstream American culture, right? Mm-hmm. They're actually using these images to sort of affirm themselves among themselves, but they're also really using them, like you're talking about, they're using them as marketing of the group to the outside. And of course, the way that you would do that as an avant-garde person would show everybody how avant-garde you actually are, right? So you get these really unconventional strategies. A link with, I'm so glad to be on the panel with these 3 people because I think Akela's paper just really sets my research up so well in terms of her thinking about interiority and how that thread totally continues. I mean, if you think about Dreyer and what she says about, I mean, she's basically thinking she's taking a snapshot of the interior of someone's psyche, just painting it rather than a photograph. And so this idea of interiority continues. It's just the way that that's expressed is less, I mean, it takes your idea of superficial appearance and just strips it away completely rather than trying to meld both interior and exterior. It just sort of
Brilliant way
throws it completely
describe
away.
it, yeah.
And then in relationship to Richard's work, I think that the artists and the portraits that I have worked on are this kind of Pandora's box in a sense that they give permission moving forward that you don't have to use mimesis, or mimesis isn't the only strategy any longer, right? So I think in terms of today, you know, with the internet and things like Facebook, you can kind of decide if you want to show your actual face, or like, do you want to show like a still life and like that's you and your portrait, your profile, right?
Or your book.
Your book. So I think that, again, like that idea of substitution is still so incredibly relevant, and you see it on the internet all the time. It's like, you know, and I think it's especially with as virtual reality keeps evolving, you know, you can decide what your avatar looks like, right? Like, it doesn't have to actually look like your physical being. You could decide, I want to actually be a still life in Second World or whatever it is. And so I think that I guess what I'm trying to say is the artists I work on sort of helped open that conversation up, and permutations of it continue today.
I agree. That's great. Thanks.
Well, I agree with Jonathan that there's a lot of connections. I mean, we're talking about basically, you know, my period segues to his, and my essay ends with Marston Hartley, because I think you don't need the body anymore if you're dealing with the interior. But Kate had asked about whether individualism and interiority matter today as they did in the past, and I'm not sure, because I think we're at a point of transition, and I think the thing with social media is that it is eroding the boundaries between public and private, and it is both public and private at the same time. Mm-hmm. So you can get this very crafted self-presentation of the, you know, the sort of the selfie that you want to represent you without your flaws, maybe touched up a little bit, and with whatever pose, showing your good side in your nice clothes and all that. But at the same time, people are sharing things that are, you know, details that would not have mattered. I mean, I was in a restaurant 2 nights ago, and there was someone taking photos of his food and posting it on social media. I mean, that kind of data is not a point that most people really need access to, and is, you know, at the level of, you know, this is what I ate on this day, in this place, at this time, and then Anthony Weiner also.
Whoa, that was like too much information.
well, that is the problem, is that you know, it's beyond the glimpse of the interior, and now we've gone down a dark corridor, and there's a little.
And there's, you know, this kind of like the dark internet, right? That actually actively seeks, you know, this kind of information to undermine governments writ large, and I mean, it's a serious security issue for the Pentagon. My, you know, friends can't take their cell phones. Literally, they have to leave them at the door. They cannot take them into the Pentagon anymore because of the spyware that's just everywhere. It's things that I think, you know, is specific to this conversation about interiority and how that's really unraveled thanks to technology. So, but I would love to open the floor for questions. Thank you so much for your very thoughtful answers. Dorothy Moss has a question over here. It's my colleague, so we are co-coordinating curators of the Women's History Initiative, so I'm on a two-name basis with her.
Hi, thank you all so much. This is so stimulating, a wonderful panel of papers. And I have thoughts for all of you, but I'm going to zoom in on two thoughts for Amy. Because actually we're in the process at the Portrait Gallery of acquiring a wonderful portrait of Linda Nochlin by Deborah Cass. It's a riff on a Warhol, and it's called Orange Disaster. And when you put up that question by Du Bois, I wondered, if that was a precursor to Linda Nochlin.
Can you remind us about the question?
Is it, why have there been no colored, why are there not many colored photographers?
Right.
So anyway, I wondered if Linda Nochlin ever references that as a sort of precursor to her groundbreaking question. But the other thought I had is about Amy Sherald and her work, her current project to bring African American subjects into a forward-looking, optimistic view of the future, and very hopeful portraits that really are meditations on photography. And I'm not sure if she talks about Woodard. I've heard her talk a lot about Du Bois, and I think that could be a productive conversation for the two of you.
Yes, can we have that, please?
Yes, I would be happy to connect you, because I think the way you talk about Woodard is very much aligned with how Amy talks about her work.
Right, I'm very drawn to her photographs. I had the opportunity to see them at the St. Louis Art Museum recently over the summer, and they really are compelling. And it's interesting, though, because unlike these photographs, and one of the struggles of my project is to think about the actual objects, right? We in the curatorial bent have to think this way. With Sherald, we're talking about the honorific portrait, right? It's sizable, it's commanding, it is in beautiful condition. The majority of the photographs I'm looking at aren't even in archives that are dedicated to the respective photographers. They're in archives of everybody else. And in one way, this makes the social networking implicit and beautiful, and you start to see the fact that Ida B. Wells is going to the same photographer that Bonnie Clark was going to. So that interlay is really wonderful. But these are objects that are in frequent circumstances are in need of conservation. They are variable in size. They exist, but the question of their existence and trying to bring them together to create a cohesive story, in my mind, is really daunting. So at this point, hence the convening, I'm asking other scholars to come in and community stakeholders, especially in Chicago, to think about how we can activate these portraits and make them more accessible.
Well, and I think another productive way to do that would be through an exhibition that brings some of these precursors to what is happening in the contemporary art world, in the space with contemporary portraiture, and talk about the continuum of these projects.
Absolutely. And one of the kind of folds of our project is to work with a Chicago artist named Samantha Hill, who has long been doing storytelling, collecting these types of photographs and recording elders from the community and their experience. Because I think one of the things that we can lose quite easily is the voices of who's in those photographs. I was just at an exhibition at the Metropolitan Museum in New York. Beautiful selection of photographs of African American subjects from the 1940s. Unfortunately, very little is known about them, and they're kind of grouped, and here's a section of couples, and here's a section of cute kids, and here's a section where everybody has a curtain in the background. But we don't have any substantive information about, as you were saying, biography as being, and evidence as being really the most important functions of the portrait. So I would love to see, and I'm really open to that. Dorothy, thank you for that recommendation. And
thank you all.
Yeah, thank you.
Next question.
Hi. Hi. So I'm Shreya. I'm actually an intern at the NPG, and as part of my internship here, I'm actually working on understanding and contextualizing the portraits of women that we have here in the gallery for the Women's History Initiative. But a problem that I've run into is that a majority of the women that we have here are painted by men. And I think that comes back to the question of black portraits or black photographs being taken by white men or white people. So then I'm just trying to understand, how do we as viewers today be mindful of the unshared experience of the sitter and the artist while still trying to extract a value from the portrait itself?
Who wants to take that question? Jonathan?
I think a lot of it, I mean, if we're talking about objects in museums, then when it's exhibited, I think foregrounding those frameworks has to be part of the label, so that the viewer can understand that complex relationship that you're touching on, because otherwise they may not have a sense of how that inflects not just what happened in the sitting, but how we understand it today and how it would have been understood contemporaneously. To sort of piggyback on Dorothy's comment, maybe have some kind of like expanding the framework and thinking about some kind of project where it pairs those portraits of women created by men and then sort of contemporary relationships that upend that. And I'm thinking here, it's sort of related but not related, of the Native American photographer Will Wilson, whose whole project is basically to undo the damage that photographers in the 19th century going and taking photographs of, like Edward Curtis, like taking photographs of Native Americans, and the Native Americans totally get the short end of the stick in that relationship, right? So as a Navajo maker, Will is all about like changing the power dynamic and changing what happens with the object at the end of the sitting, and also very much taking on the issues that you're talking about, like in a very conscious way, like it's in his artist statement.
It's nice.
If I could speak a little bit to that too. I think it's interesting sometimes when we dive deeper into the archive, we can find out more about the subject and the women and the relationship that they had with their portraitist. So for example, in the work of Archibald Motley, when we did the most recent retrospective, we were actually able to identify one of the sitters. And typically we look at Motley's work so often as objectifying women, really creating a kind of color hierarchy in terms of skin, and reflecting and reifying those positions. And in this case, we were actually able to come into a deeper understanding that the woman he was portrayed, this painting called Portrait of a Cultured Lady, is actually Edna Gale, who was an NAACP activist, had a gallery, and actually was a former love interest of the artist as well. So sometimes it's that kind of reclamation and just looking deeper and in different directions that can likewise create then a different kind of perspective than initially we might have had.
Sounds like a lot of research is necessary. So we're glad that you're staying on as an intern with us.
Yeah, thank you for that, for sure.
Next question.
My question's for Amy also. I'm going backwards to Frederick Douglass. There's been a lot of attention recently to his thoughts on photography. I'm thinking of Ginger Hill's essay, I think, most particularly. But the sort of paradox that he was unhappy with engravings, engraved portraiture, because of the way white artists could manipulate things, in particular the one where they give him a little smile, and he didn't like that. But like for him, at least as Hill thinks of it, I think, is that the subjectivity of the subject comes out through what he called objective portraiture, right? To show someone as they really are, then puts them in a position to think of themselves as having, as being the subject of art. Right. And he used that term. So he uses the term objective and art in the same sentence, right? And I'm wondering if Woodard's photographers, or if he wrote about, in particular, the use of light and dealing with skin tones. I've seen some scholarship on advice that was given to white photographers about how to not overexpose white people, but I don't know if there's much scholarship on how black photographers were thinking about black subjectivity and and in particular representing skin tones. And I wondered, in a lot of the tones seem to be light skin tones in the photographs you showed me, but I don't know if that's how the photographer is treating the subject, or if there was, are they talking about this? Are they thinking about this? Are they pioneering techniques of lighting that will be better at doing what they're trying to do? And you sort of gestured towards he sort of wants to say other people are, like white photographers aren't doing it well. Is that right? So I'm just wondering, what's the discourse about that?
Right. No, definitely. I'd be happy to speak on that. Again, from Douglass, we learned that, we should look to photography to literally make ourselves object of contemplation, because then we will be thought of. So it's a charge that definitely comes from Pictures in Progress, and Ginger Hill and a few other scholars have done such a great job with Maurice Wallace and Sean Michelle Smith too, are leading that way. So I'm deeply aware and appreciative of their work. In regards to Woodard's approach, the first thing too we always have to remember when we have a presentation like this is that you are seeing a photo of the photo of the photo ad infinitum, right? So we are very much removed from the original, even though of course we try to be mindful of the coloring. And in terms of skin tone, definitely it just really depended on the subject. We see Woodard go very broad. If you looked for example, if you can recall, Assistant Attorney Harris Gates, he has darker skin. Where you have lighter skin in some of Bonnie Clark, but that was also really heavily facilitated by makeup and the like. So people have different range of skin tones, and I think that was the remark that Du Bois was calling out, is that people weren't actually looking at the individual. Instead, they were kind of approaching it in a formulaic way. And so with Woodard, he was really interested in using avant-garde technologies. And this is, again, one of the reasons why for my project I want to bring in people with greater expertise in photographic technology, because he was interested in, yes, using different lighting within the studio, and then likewise looking to something that was called, for example, a circuit camera that gave a broader panorama at the time. And I just don't have this kind of expertise yet. I will learn in the process. But I do think that this is definitely one of the reasons that Woodard wanted to advocate that he could do a better job, because he was attentive to that. He knew the politics of skin tone. He knew the way that the individual wanted to look and not have their skin tones lightened. Recently I was going through material at the Schomburg, and you can see individuals in a photo book kind of crossing out some of the photos because they're overexposed. So it's this constant attentiveness that you have to be mindful of to get a likeness that was in keeping with how you really are. And then likewise, the fact that Woodard was aware that people are comparing to lighten your skin is very much to make a political act, for however you want that to be interpreted. So I think that individuals may have chosen that, and then I think other individuals did not want that. I think, again, you have to kind of think about it as per a person's preference, if they have that agency.
And I love the Madam C.J. Walker graduating class.
Yes.
Because you have a lot of, that's like she used face lightening techniques, I think. And so that was an interesting kind of scale, because you have very dark skinned women as well as light skinned women.
Right, definitely. There's such a panoply of photographers working. Again, I just picked Woodard and went with it, but there are a variety, especially around entrepreneurship in cosmetology, because Madam C.J. Walker established these schools in Chicago. There are a variety of photographers then that come to be employed by the entrepreneurial women who are in need of their services, both for advertisement and then likewise to document the events that they are doing. Yeah. So it's really this nexus. So again, if you are interested in this work, please come work with us.
Could I just say,
is there another question that might be specific? We don't have a ton of time, so I just want to keep us moving.
We have one back here.
Okay, great.
Hi, Virginia Badgett, UC Santa Barbara. Thank you to the previous audience member. I also was going to ask Dr. Mooney a more technical question, but that's been addressed. So I've got a bit of a heavy hitter, and this is something that has come up in a number of the talks, just the profound amount of visual data, whether through the selfie or visual culture in general, that we are experiencing in a society that is rapidly changing. And so my question is, in our current socio-political environment, how do we, what are some strategies that we can use outside this room of experts to help the general public to see visual, essentially my question is about visual literacy and the museum audience or just the public at large, because we all know that we see the world very differently than a lot of people, and especially funding being cut for the arts, art history not being taught in a lot of public schools, anyway, et cetera, et cetera. Thank you.
Akela or Rick?
As a director of a college museum, we talk about this all the time, and we've increasingly experimented with digital technology in different forms in exhibitions, and we have basically a center for digital technology at the college, and there are faculty who are encouraged to embrace that in their teaching, whether it's in the humanities or the sciences or whatever. In the museum, I think we all face that same issue of, how do you get people to look who are not conditioned to look? That it's not something that we value in ways that we should, and we dismiss it, I think, at some peril. We start with young learners, introductory learners in elementary school, in getting them in front of objects, and with, these are children who this may be their first experience of going to a museum, and so they're, they may be 5 or 6 years old, and putting them down in front of an object that probably has a narrative. It might be a portrait, but there's something else going on in it, and we just ask them to react to it and tell us what they see in front of them, and it's amazing how quickly children's minds can work in terms of relating what they're looking at to something that they know in their own realm, particularly with their family. And so you might have 5 children gathered in front of a painting, and you might get 5 very different analyses of what's going on. It reminds me a little bit of CAA, but that you're saying, well, really, you can see that in that picture. I'm surprised. But nevertheless, you get them to look, and you get them to verbalize what they are seeing. And if you can capture them at that age, then you're kind of preconditioning them to looking at things more closely, whatever it is, as they go forward. In terms of college audiences and classes that have experimented with laptops and particularly iPads and other kinds of devices that we want to embrace that technology, but I've observed that we've had students, for example, we did an exhibit on art in pre-World War I Germany, and we were looking, the students in the class were telling stories, and then they were telling stories they were taking works that might be a drawing by, or a watercolor by Otto Dix, and you would then analyze that, and they might add to it and create a narrative from that. Where is this going? Or a drawing of a couple sitting in a park, and this would be from the Weimar period where there was enormous poverty in Germany, and they would put words in the mouths of a mother and a daughter and commenting on other people in the park. Why is that person, they've lost a leg, or why are they seem to be destitute, or whatever. So again, it's coming out of just looking at it, not knowing whether that this is a meaningful answer or not, but trying to contextualize it and to expand the universe of what you're looking at in front of you. I think there's some cases where digital technology really doesn't work that well. We've had some flops, I would say, where people come in, visitors come in, and they have to be comfortable with the technology, and they have to want to use it. So I think it's an institution by institution process, and you have to know your audience. But I think it's a great question, and I think where I am, we're thinking about it all the time at whatever age group we're trying to deal with, and how do you get them to look, and how do you get them to appreciate history?
Do you have anything to add?
Yeah, I'd like to add a little bit to it because in spite of the fact that we have a lot more images now. This is not a new problem, and it's been long lamented that why doesn't the public better understand art? You know, in the progressive era, they were introducing art classes in the settlement houses to try to uplift the impoverished individuals and, you know, make them more accepting and appreciative of the fine arts. As a cynic, I think it's kind of a lost cause. I think it's going to be
my team.
It's going to be a self-selecting audience, and until we do a better job of not simply attracting affluent white people to museums, then we're not going to be reaching, you know, a diverse audience. The other thing is that I think the proliferation of images has also made it harder to look.
Definitely.
I teach history students, so my audience is a little bit different, but they're afraid of images, to talk about images. They don't want to engage with them because they don't trust them as much as texts. They're much more comfortable if they have words, which I find a little strange. And so I have tried my best in the small sphere of students that I can influence to make them actually see and use real things, real documents, nothing digital. I mean, I use slides in class, but when I can, I want them out of the classroom engaging with reality, because they don't do that often enough. And whether they be archival documents or understanding the materiality of things and how you manipulate them and the size that you're dealing with and how you hold it and what it means to have that object, I think is really important, especially as we become more virtual.
That's great. We have one last 2-minute section for a burning desire over here.
Well, I want to thank each of you for extremely stimulating presentations, and also just compliment the organizers for pulling this particular panel together. Apologies for a slightly inchoate question, but I hope you'll be able to help me even make sense of this tension. One of the things that I really liked about this combination of papers is I felt like it helped me to think a little bit about, to borrow Jonathan's quotation of Michel Foucault, this problem of the trap of the visual. And in many ways, Rick, I thought your paper was a perfect complement to Akela's in terms of this question of how do we represent a soul? How do we tease out that which is not easily seen through a visual medium like portraiture? And Amy, I think thinking about this question of how we represent particular communities photographically is interesting, and obviously Jonathan is doing a lot to deconstruct some of those assumptions through his work with abstract portraiture. And so I think what I'd like to ask about is the degree to which our contemporary culture is perhaps reifying this trap of the visual, and that's maybe the biggest concern I have in looking at some of the selfies. Although they're incredibly intriguing, they seem to, I think, solidify and freeze some of the visual categories that we might already use to understand, or even more problematic, reinforce certain embedded ideas that we might already have about one another. And so I think what I'd like to ask, if I may, each of you perhaps to comment on briefly, is the degree to which you feel portraiture as a practice can provide us with tools and techniques to help the public dislodge some of the assumptions that we may automatically make between the pictures of faces and bodies that we see and the motivations or ideas or aspirations that might lie behind them.
I'm probably going to have a very different answer to this from Akela, but in a course that I teach about portraiture, I begin the class with 3 sets of comparisons. They're 19th century photographs, and they're two sets of 19th century photographs and one of portraits of 2 men from the modern era. One comparison And I ask the students, I say, just look at these images for about 5 minutes, and then write down, if you had an opportunity to spend time with one of these two people, who were you more drawn to? And the comparisons consist of James Gordon Bennett and John Wilkes Booth, the first graduate of Middlebury College, and Lizzie Borden, and John Grisham, and the person who was a serial murderer in Chicago in the 70s. And invariably, now granted, it's a kind of an artificial exercise, but the question that I'm trying to get them to answer, just even to begin to know that's important, what can we learn by observation of someone's physical, with the way they're standing, what they're wearing, whether they're physically attractive in terms of our modern sense of ourselves, and then how realistic is that? How real is it? Or are we misinformed by what the photographer has done? And invariably, there was one student I had who got all of them wrong. And I said, a first-year student, and I said, I'm going to call your mother. And I'm going to say, no dating. So, but it's kind of, it works, because I've used it on different audiences as well, not college students, but adults, fellow faculty members at Middlebury. And the answer is invariably the same. If they're inconsistent. Granted, it's a quick exercise, but my point is, I'm less convinced about what we can really determine in terms of the soul and the spirit and the character of someone from the exterior. That's my take. So.
Maybe I'm so sorry, we have to go break for lunch soon, but maybe,
So
maybe,
I guess
Jonathan.
Your comments, in my mind, beg the question about, is there a difference between a visual image of someone's face that a government is using to control their actions and a portrait? In my estimation, a portrait has some kind of intention behind it that is more than about whether you can get on this airplane or not. I don't know. I would need to think some more about that. But I think that your comments in terms of what's happening now, like I remember reading this article. It's happening in China right now, where particular ethnic minorities who have some kind of disregarded political standing because of facial recognition technology are literally not being allowed to leave the country or only go to certain places in the country, et cetera. So I think it's something that
Police surveillance.
Foucault is this tension, because on the one hand, you don't want to be visible because then you can slip through the cracks if you're not visible. But if on the other hand, like Facebook, recently, because of all of the politics that have infiltrated Facebook, friends and colleagues are deleting their profile or not using it as much, and it's well, do they even exist anymore, right? Because they're no longer visible. They're choosing not to be visible.
I think it comes down to really a question of intentionality, which we know we cannot control ultimately. So yes, you can use a portrait to be a mode of identification, and we understand that those are systems that are oppressive and definitely interested in using them for subjugation. But when I think about the process of portraiture, and we're talking about these social relationships, and the selfie, yes, it's about you, but you are putting it out as social media in hopes to create relationships with others, even if those are feigned and only existing in your head. That's the purpose there. So I think that this is, when we think about the portrait, it's about your subjectivity, but it also invites you to come to look for that subjectivity, the subjectivity of another and how you are in an exchange. And so yes, we can even then go back to a dynamic and think about it in a nefarious Foucaultian way, where ultimately the goal is oppression. But I also like to think that there are opportunities for networking, for resistance, for sharing, and actually being genuine and civil to one another.
Akela, the last word.
Some of it, I think, gets at what Jonathan was saying about what defines a portrait. And I think we need maybe a new definition, or little p portraiture versus big P portraiture. Because I think with something like Facebook, I think that there's a lot that, while it's all public, I think there's a lot that people would deny, or that they don't, that employers actually look to Facebook. It seems unfair that that's my personal profile. That's not me. That's not the public me, except for it is. And I think that definition of what is, again, what's public, what's private, there's a boundary that's kind of between them that's getting fuzzy. And I think that relates to portraiture, because portraiture is historically a public kind of act. I mean, you don't get a portrait to stare at it yourself. It is in part to present you to a community, even if it's a small community. And I think that's something that we need to think about.
It's a particularly telling issue this week in terms of the Supreme Court.
Yes.
Oh, definitely. Okay, well, with that, thank you. Let's thank our presenters one last time. And we would like to see you back here at 2 o'clock, please. So enjoy your lunch.